Today on Earth Focus, global warning. The CIA and NASA tackle climate change, the new geopolitics of a melting Arctic, and the security challenges facing Bangladesh. The Medill School of Journalism reports. Coming up on Earth Focus. Extreme weather, flooding, drought, rising seas, retreating glaciers. These are some of the faces of climate change. They have the potential to create humanitarian disasters on a scale we've never seen before. And this can lead to political instability if the needs of society exceed the ability of governments to cope. The U.S. military and intelligence agencies increasingly see climate change as a national security issue.
Climate change will affect resource competition. It will affect where we can get fresh water, how we get our food, what energy we consume. Sea level will affect migration and demographics, and potentially how those interrelationships play out will determine the security of the 21st century.
Is there a link between U.S. national security and climate change? Graduate students from the Medill School of Journalism looked into it and came up with some surprising results.
The Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, has run a Washington journalism program for more than 40 years. Of all the many things that journalism schools around the country teach their students to report about, national security has not been a front burner issue.
That's why Medill launched the National Security Initiative in 2009. The National Security Reporting Project is part of it.
It's a way to try to find new and better ways, more innovative ways of telling national security stories and understanding the issues and training young journalists and working journalists to how to cover these complex issues in such a challenging media environment.
But I think what's really important, I hope, about this project is to show issues of national security that might surprise people.
And each year we'll have a different topic and a different title. The first one was Global Warning on the national security implications of climate change.
10 students interviewed more than 200 national security experts over a 3-month period, traveling to the Arctic Circle, Bangladesh, Peru, North Carolina, and Texas. Here are 4 of their stories.
So our story took a look at the CIA's Center for Climate Change and National Security. It grabbed headlines when the Obama administration kicked it off in 2009, September 2009, but nobody had really taken a look at what they were actually doing over there.
Having covered the CIA for as many years as I have, I know that if they've actually created a center for something, that means that they've been concerned about it for about 15 years.
CIA climate analysts are starting to connect the dots between national security and issues like water flows, food security, disease, and displaced people.
No one, I think, would dispute that those are classic intelligence problems to worry about. Well, how it affects governance, how it affects people in countries, that ends up affecting and maybe causing wars, failed states.
Intelligence analysts are saying that the U.S. is ill-prepared to act on climate changes that are coming faster than anticipated and threaten to destabilize areas of U.S. national interest.
Well, it's widely acknowledged that the military is going to be on the front lines of dealing with climate change. The military is, on the front lines of dealing with many disasters, natural disasters and conflicts.
Military officials say they lack climate-related intel to prepare for the future. But getting that intel can be a challenge.
What the intelligence community is about is really stealing secrets from enemies and potential enemies.
There's a lot of people that are very invested in the Cold War mentality of the CIA who don't think that we need to be sending, spies on the ground in Somalia to see how hunger and disease are becoming national security threats, but those are becoming things that could easily swamp some of the pre-existing threats that we have, including the Cold War or even terrorism.
The CIA has been very clearly tasked with looking at the consequences of climate change, but not at the causes of climate change. That's a political lightning rod, and intelligence officials writ large who are working on this issue are very clearly avoiding the political piece of it.
There were people in Congress that basically from the get-go were saying that we don't want to fund any of this because we just don't believe in climate change.
The intelligence community became involved in environmental issues in the 1990s.
Gore and Gates figured out, and people who were working with them, that it would be a good idea to use these national security systems, mainly the reconnaissance satellites, to systematically provide information to scientists who needed it for understanding things like climate change.
During the Bush administration, these efforts kind of got dispersed and put elsewhere. De-emphasized is the phrase that we heard a few times. The Bush administration, it's widely acknowledged, did not put an emphasis on climate science and in fact distrusted some of the science. And so during those years, not only was the intelligence community not focused on these efforts, but a lot of the science was not funded as well.
But in 2009, the then new CIA director and now Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, opened a center at the CIA specifically focused on links between climate change and national security.
What our story found is that the center is catching up on efforts that were put behind during the Bush years.
Though much of its work is classified, the center is helping fill in gaps and provide intel that military and policymakers can act on.
Intelligence officials and military officials are wondering, okay, we've got these global forecasts for how climate change is going to affect the world. We've even got some regional forecasts, but what does that mean for Nigeria? What does that mean for Egypt? What will that mean for water supplies along the Nile, for water flows between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between Pakistan and India?
CIA climate analysts are linking regional climate projections with political and demographic information. And through the National Academy of Sciences, the CIA is working with leading climatologists.
Folks within the intelligence community have been talking more and more frequently about climate change as a risk. The security community thinks about risk and even science in a different way than the political world does.
And what the Navy is saying and the CIA is saying is it doesn't matter if this is a man-made threat, it doesn't matter if it's a natural threat, it could even be a cyclical threat, which some of the biggest critics say. What they're saying is it doesn't matter. What matters is that we have to respond to it.
The phrase that you hear again and again from intelligence officers, from DoD officials, is if we wait for 100% certainty, we're dead. So they see climate change as a risk, as something that can destabilize nations, that can change the security environment that they're dealing with.
Climate change risk assessment means preparing for tomorrow, and that doesn't sit well with politicians who are focused on today.
It may require a lot of money up front with diffuse benefits that again may not accrue until much later on. And so in a political system that rewards the immediate benefits and on very short timelines, election cycles and like, that's difficult for those political leaders operating in that system to take those steps.
With calls for belt tightening coming from every corner, the intelligence community's work on climate change may be in jeopardy.
I think that you have more bipolarization of Congress and lack of sort of frank and honest discussions about issues like this, and I think that bodes very poorly for issues like climate change.
What the Orbiting Carbon Observatory was supposed to do was something new.
NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory, the world's first and only satellite to monitor carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, failed at launch in 2009, depriving scientists of a chance to understand a key variable for climate change.
The satellites basically are our eyes and ears on the planet, and if they're not in a position to be gathering the kind of intelligence that they need to assess the threat over a prolonged period of time, we're in trouble because we just don't know what's happening.
And a lot of these satellites are kind of living on borrowed life right now. They're living past what was expected originally for when they were going to survive.
There's a lot of satellites up there that are also in danger of essentially, malfunctioning, at any time.
It's not just that the instruments are old or that we don't have the right ones. It's that you have to identify precise technologies you need and then put them on top of a rocket and blast them into space.
And that takes time and money. NASA tries to save money, often by not having backup satellites. So if a satellite fails, there is no backup to immediately take its place. NASA has to scramble for new money to start all over again.
What you need is really not so much a few more satellites. You need a steady pipeline of satellites going up every year or two with different kinds of instruments, with improved instruments that let you have a good picture of what's going on the planet.
For 2 decades, the U.S. Earth observation satellite system has been hit by competing priorities, shrinking budgets, and mismanagement.
During the Bush administration, a lot of the work that had been started by the Clinton administration in using satellites to understand climate change essentially were put on ice, for lack of a better term.
Under the Bush administration, NASA's Earth science budget was cut by more than 30% to free up money for space exploration, including a mission to Mars. Cut or shelved were satellite missions to monitor tropical rainfall, sea levels, glacial movement, soil moisture, permafrost, and to improve forecasting of droughts and floods.
And that had to be resuscitated again. But the problem is you lose the continuity of data.
You want scientists to be able to look at the past 40 years of data research. You don't want them to say, here's 30 years, and here's a 7-year gap, and then here's more information. And we're not really sure exactly what happened in that gap. We can maybe fill it in with some information from the ground, with some information from planes, which you are seeing in some cases. But we didn't have that great data, or at least as good as we could get data from satellites that entire time that helped us understand what's going to come next.
The Obama administration took steps to restore funding for the Earth satellite monitoring budget.
What we've seen are the president putting out a budget, for example, that asks for a fair amount of money for NASA funding in order to do more research and to build more of these satellites. And he's not necessarily getting it. He's getting a diminished form of his budget, and it doesn't necessarily have enough money for him to do everything that NASA scientists and NOAA scientists are asking him to do. So what we're getting is not enough money for them to continue following up on all of these climate variables that they're just starting to understand and starting to find ways to measure.
Everyone wants to cut the budget, and cutting space is kind of a luxury.
And when you attach something like climate change to a program, the problem is that you have politics that comes into it, and all of the politics that are associated with the term climate change. Now, in Congress, this is a bad time to be asking for money.
So the problem isn't the next few years because of the spending that's been done since 2009. The problem is what comes after that. Will we sustain a robust observation system? And right now I'd say that's at risk.
I think the reason why I focused on Bangladesh was because it just seemed like people were talking about the humanitarian crisis, but no one was really trying to explore the link, between climate change and security in that region. And at the same time, the entire concept of the United States sort of looking at that region was also, unexplored in the media. So it was definitely something that I wanted to explore more and, investigate.
When it comes to climate change, Bangladesh is ground zero. This low-lying nation, strategically sandwiched between India and China, already suffers from regular catastrophic floods. Any sea level rise here will be an existential problem for the country and a potential crisis for global security.
So now when you look at Bangladesh, it has one of the highest population densities in the world. There are a lot of other problems like Islamic radicalization, poverty. The country is sort of a young democracy, and it's sort of grappling with a lot of grassroots level issues.
By 2050, when Bangladesh's population reaches 200 million, rising sea levels may claim 20% of the country's landmass. Over 30 million people will be homeless, and food production could be decimated.
What I foresee, to start with, there will be internal destabilization within the society. There will be social breakdown of cohesion because groups will fight against another group to find resources to survive. But eventually what is going to happen is we completely understand that these people will try and reach higher and drier ground, and the only way they can move towards is to move to India.
And that may not be possible. India has constructed a 2,500-mile fence on its border with Bangladesh to prevent smuggling of weapons and narcotics and to keep illegal immigrants out.
As a matter of fact, I would call this is the world's largest human cage, because India, foreseeing such an eventuality, has already fenced Bangladesh on all three sides and is now in the process of electrifying the fence. The border between Bangladesh and India is about the most lethal border in the world. Over the last 9 years, over 1,000 Bangladeshi civilians have been killed by Indian border guards. Given that kind of a background and a scenario, if you imagine that large number of people are trying to cross over into India, crossing the fence, there will be a human catastrophe because the Indian side is going to resist any kind of border crossing by Bangladeshi climate migrants.
The U.S. Navy is often the first responder in international crisis, and Bangladesh will likely be no exception. The U.S. military is concerned. In 2009, the U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island conducted its first war game, or simulation exercise, to respond to possible climate change-related conflicts. One of the scenarios looked at South Asia, including the impact of climate change on mass migration in Bangladesh.
One of the findings was that the U.S. Department of Defense noticed that there were a lot of gaps if they were to deal with such an issue. For instance, would the U.S. Navy, which is the first responder during an international humanitarian crisis, have the ships to sort of ferry millions of people to safety? Would they have ships that could, provide potable water to people that they were moving? Also, what about interagency communication? How would, the U.S. Department of State communicate with the U.S. Department of Defense? What would be the level of involvement of all these different agencies? How would they come together and work together to solve this crisis?
So you have an issue of water security. You have an issue of health security, probably going up to the level of pandemics. You have a mass migration of people. You have states' critical infrastructure under stress. And all these are happening at one time, at one point, on a state whose internal capacity of the state is very, very weak and fragile. So we are really painting a scenario which could very easily go down to a meltdown, and we could very possibly even see a state-of-state collapse.
U.S. officials acknowledge that these new challenges would require a shift from the traditional military role of fighting wars. They will require leveraging existing networks of military partners around the world to deal with expected fallout from climate change.
And they realized that they had dealt with humanitarian crises or, natural disasters in that region. An unprecedented sort of event of this magnitude would require a much larger sort of response, a much more sophisticated response, because this sort of a situation would be very, very complex.
The U.S. and Bangladeshi militaries are collaborating on a range of issues, including counterterrorism, narcotics, and arms smuggling. But they fall short when it comes to climate change and national security.
While at the higher level, this issue of climate change and national security was being talked about and discussed. When you looked at the grassroots level sort of, programs and other sort of military aid being provided to the Bangladesh military, it had yet to trickle down. This whole idea, of climate change, national security.
no military in the world has ever been trained for climate-induced conditions or climate-induced consequences that we are now likely to face. It needs a complete new set of skill sets. It needs retooling. It needs different kind of planning levels. It needs different kind of scenario planning exercises. It needs also compatibility among militaries of the world. We have not done anything of this nature so far. So therefore the militaries of the world have not only got to train on a national basis, they've got to train on an international basis, so that they're prepared to meet with the consequences when it happens.
What was happening in the Arctic was so interesting to me because the physical changes in the Arctic are so visible right now and are so immediate and are happening so quickly. In 2007, the Arctic ice was at record lows like they'd never seen, and then in 2008 it was the second lowest ice level they'd ever seen, in 2009 the third lowest ice level they'd ever seen.
The reason for disappearing ice is climate change. Not only is there less ice, but the remaining ice is not as thick as it used to be.
Ice that's been in the Arctic has been there for a very, very long time. That type of ice is really thick, and it's called multi-year ice. That's been what's melting, and when it refreezes, it comes back as first-year ice, which is very thin, and most people and animals can't walk on it and can't sort of exist on it.
Multi-year ice shrank by approximately the size of California and Texas combined between 2005 and 2007. Temperatures are rising twice as fast in the Arctic than in the rest of the world. And at this rate, the Arctic could be ice-free in the summers as early as 2013. And that is a game changer.
This opens up what Admiral Gary Roughead, our Chief of Naval Operations, calls the fifth ocean of the world, which will again have tremendous impacts on resource extraction, on trade, and the security of all nations.
There's simply more easy navigation, territorial disputes, potential trade opportunities, resource issues, all of which could be leading to conflicts.
It's an ocean. The Navy needs to ensure maritime security in all the oceans of the world.
There's already been some very serious confrontations among countries facing off over who owns not only the right to passage in the Arctic Circle, but even more so the minerals and oil and gas that's underneath it, which is a huge cache of the world's energy supply.
25% of the remaining resources, oil, gas, mineral resources of the world, remain in the Arctic.
The Arctic region covers 1/6 of the Earth's surface. 5 nations, Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States, have territorial borders here. The jockeying for control is already on. In 2007, Russia planted a flag in the waters beneath the North Pole. The Russians are building icebreakers and nuclear power stations on their northern coast. Canada has a new fleet of F-35 fighter jets and plans for a new base on its Arctic shore. Denmark is forming an Arctic command. Even the Chinese are in the game. China already has the world's largest non-nuclear icebreaker and is building more for Arctic exploration. But the U.S. lags behind. 2 of the 3 existing U.S. Coast Guard polar icebreakers are non-operational, and 1 is used for scientific research. And the U.S. has to contract with foreign nations to perform Arctic research, logistics, and supply operations.
The United States military is going to have to consider how it equips itself, for example. I mean, if you look at the Navy right now, they're looking seriously at buying more icebreakers because of the Arctic thawing and the fact that the Northwest Passage may open, and that's an area that you have to have a presence in because of the increased economy there and shipping, etc.
I mean, if the Rear Admiral of the Coast Guard, and in the Navy tells you, like, I don't feel prepared here. I need icebreakers. I need this equipment. I can't operate in the way that you're asking me to. Like, I think that's something we need to take seriously.
The U.S. has no permanent military installations within the Arctic Circle, and the northern U.S. border is so poorly monitored that foreigners have landed undetected on U.S. soil.
German cruise ship was able to travel to the northern tip of Alaska. 200 people were able to get off of Alaska, walk around Barrow, and the mayor, nor the Coast Guard, nor, as far as I know, anyone in the United States knew this was happening.
Both the Bush and Obama administrations said the Arctic is a key strategic interest, but funding to ensure that the U.S. can operate successfully here is far from certain. There is one immediate step the U.S. could take.
The U.S. government was one of the authors of the Law of the Sea Treaty and the prime movers of creating in the first place, and now we're one of the few countries that's not a signatory to it, despite the fact that many of the most knowledgeable experts in the U.S. government, Republicans and Democrats, military and civilian, have all said that we absolutely need to be a party to the Law of the Sea Treaty, and yet we're not.
Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a nation that can prove its continental shelf extends past the current boundary of 200 miles off its coastline can be granted up to 150 additional miles of seabed. And that can mean billions of dollars in resources.
If we want to preserve the full wide range of options for future generations to go ahead and develop the resources above Alaska, we need to demonstrate persistent presence and ownership of the waters in the areas, the exclusive economic zone, and make an extended continental shelf claim by signing the Law of the Sea above Alaska today. So our actions today shape the future. That's why it's important now.
Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.